The root of the problem is cultural. The collapse of internal cohesion, how children get socialized, reverence for tradition, a concern for the decent opinion of your fellows, dignity. I think they, or the lack thereof, are the root of the problem. But to argue in that fashion in our time is to be laughed out of court. They'll call you a Christian, a prude. The propaganda of Black Lives Matter turns its complete back on the things that I'm affirming here.
You grew up on the south side of Chicago. Now, I was born in the mid 90s, and by the time I was of age to pay attention, even passingly, to the news or read commentary, it became clear to me very quickly that the south side of Chicago was a kind of code word for everything that's fucked up about Black inner cities in particular. It's a kind of shorthand for talking about every inner city in the country, because it is considered the quintessential example. It's the first place people list when they talk about the crime and the inner city problem. For example, south side of Chicago, and everyone knows what you mean by it. I'm curious, when you were growing up in the south side of Chicago in a very different era, really in the 60s, and a little earlier, what was it like, and how do you account for any transformation between the south side of Chicago that you knew as a kid and the south side of Chicago that became the watchword for inner city degeneration?
Yeah, that's a good thing to talk about, because I know what you mean when you say the south side of Chicago is iconic in exemplifying the urban failure, Black urban pathology, crime, carjackings, homicide, gangs, and inner city decay. And you say you were born in the 90s, and I think it probably already had advanced very much in that direction by then. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and that's a long time ago. And it was different. I mean, you had good neighborhoods and you had bad neighborhoods on the south side, and good neighborhoods were quite okay. I mean, in the street that I grew up on, in my mother's sister's house that we lived upstairs in the back, I, as a kid, slept on the living room couch. I didn't have a bed. It was a 2-bedroom apartment. My sister and I were too old to share a bedroom. She had the bedroom. I had the front room closet and the couch. And this was a small apartment upstairs in the back of my Auntie Lois's house, which was a grand house. They had carved out a little apartment upstairs, a kind of au pair suite upstairs in the back, and made a 2-bedroom apartment out of it. But, I slept on the couch. But I never heard gunshots. There were no drug vials or paraphernalia in the gutter. You could leave your bicycle on the lawn in the backyard and nobody would climb over the fence and take it and ride away with it. There were fruit trees. People kept their lawns nice on this street. The street had bungalows, little small single-family detached houses, and low-intensity apartment buildings, 2 flats, 3 flats. There might be a 6-flat apartment building with a courtyard where 3 apartments on either side. That's as tenement-like as it got in that neighborhood. Now, you could go a mile to the west from Park Manor, the community that I lived in when I was a kid, across the Dan Ryan Expressway, an interstate, divided limited access highway, to another neighborhood still on the south side, and the architecture was different. The nature of life on the streets was different. The people were different. It was not a good neighborhood. There was more crime. There were hookers on the street. There was open drinking at the Honky Tonk Tavern. People spilling out onto the sidewalk with brown paper bags. There was louder music. It was rougher. Still the south side. I have the impression, my son still lives in Chicago on the south side, my son Alden, that most of the south side is like those bad neighborhoods where when I was coming up in the 1950s and 60s, and worse. So I watched the TV show The Chi, the Paramount series and set in Chicago. I'm behind. I think the show was filmed in the late teens, 2017, 18, 19 or whatever, but it's set in Chicago and on the South Side. And I recognize the neighborhoods, the street signs, the elevated train tracks, the architecture, what the buildings look like. But I don't recognize the society. I mean, it's a completely different world.
Yeah. This is a topic I've been interested in because of my interest in the issue of, racial inequality. There is this literature on why it is the case that the Black family broadly was quote unquote intact, meaning most Black kids before 1950, 1940 were growing up in two-parent households, which was very surprising to me when I first read it. I actually didn't believe it.
Wow.
Because it's such a ubiquitous phenomenon my whole life that 60-70% of Black kids are grow up in out of wedlock homes. It was difficult for me to imagine a reality in which that number was closer to 10 or 20%. As it is, you're born into the world, you assume things have always been the way that they are. So to read Herbert Gutman's book, meticulously detailing the fact you look at Black families right after the Civil War, you have 80%. 80% of kids are in two-parent households, not so far off from the number among white Americans for something like 80 years. And the data actually looks pretty convincing, right? It's like, and then you see, I think I saw a video of a random street corner in Harlem in like 1920 or something. And every single Black person walking on the street is like actually just dressed like the Hollywood recreation of movies from that era. Like everyone is dressed nicely. And having lived for four years in Harlem, that's impossible. I can see how a Hollywood producer would create that set because it's, people dress like this. But then to actually see video of it and to think that people actually, like everyone dressed well to leave the house, is really amazing to contemplate the cultural difference between that era in Black America and today. On the other hand, I've also had this thought of, what if there were similar issues of, what if on paper people were married, but behind the scenes there was all kinds of chaos as well. And the chaos was just not the kind of chaos it's easy to see in census figures, right? And so maybe not as much is different than would meet the eye. I'm curious what you have to say about that issue, having lived kind of long enough to see different versions of Black America.
So, like I said, I came along in the 50s and 60s. It was a big deal in 1965 when Daniel Patrick Moynihan, published that infamous and well-discussed report, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, in which he was alarmed to note that 25% of kids born to a Black woman were born to a woman without a husband. And based upon his own, that is Moynihan, the late Senator Moynihan, then a bureaucrat working in the Labor Department under President Johnson, producing a report that he thought was going to be for internal eyes only, but it ended up getting leaked and became a cause célèbre and a object of ridicule and denunciation because he talked candidly about what was going on in the Black family. But he was 25% is what he was looking at. And he was willing to conclude on the basis of that, this is what made this thing so explosive, that Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, War on Poverty, Anti-Discriminating Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, the hope that the Negro, quote unquote, would become free, a full citizen, that whole project was jeopardized. It wasn't clear that you could achieve the objectives of integrating the Negro, quote unquote, into the body politics / economic if you didn't somehow address the family. He was willing to talk about putting on extra shifts at the post office so you would employ more Negro men. Again, quote, because at that time, the idea that a man would be a more attractive partner if he had a good paying job, and that might help to heal whatever the breach was between men and women that was producing this alarming 25%. Okay. And as you know, looking today, you're talking 70%, 75%. And the best that people can say about it is, well, nuclear family is not the only way of raising kids. And, don't be a respectability politics prude. Cultural argument itself, is it respectable in our time? I mean, if I were to say this is the root of the problem, and that to me, that's a defensible sociological position, sociological/historical position. The root of the problem is cultural. The collapse of internal cohesion, how children get socialized, how men and women deal with other, reverence for tradition, a concern for the opinion, the decent opinion of your fellows, dignity, these kind of things. I think they, or the lack thereof, are the root of the problem. But to argue in that fashion in our time is to be laughed out of court. No one will take you seriously. They'll call you a Christian if you happen to have any kind of religious sensibility, a prude. You're not with the most fashionable, latest, postmodern abandonment of traditional institution. You think that has anything to do with the race problem? The propaganda of Black Lives Matter turns its complete back on the things that I'm affirming here. So I'm sorry to get exercised, but I think I've actually lost track of what your original question was.
No, you're answering it obliquely. It's, like what is your vantage point on the unraveling of Black family statistics over the past 100 years? Is it the crux of the issue? Is it really the case that in 1920 the societies Gutman is looking at in his book are is a much healthier version of Black America that we have lost? Or is it that those statistics weren't capturing all of the chaos that was present at the time?
I think it's the former, that something was lost. Though I think it's a prudent, cautionary reflex that you exhibit to say, don't take things at face value. Just because the form was a certain thing doesn't mean the substance was a certain thing. And I think the quote unquote collapse in the form that we've seen since 1950 might, to a certain degree, betray something that was already there, but that only with the promptings of, the incentives from Great Society welfare programs, or the liberation of women and the complete sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s, or the kind of sexual, I guess I'll be repeating myself, that it set loose something that was already there, waiting to be set loose within Black culture, that then manifested itself. Everything wasn't peaches and cream. My own story kind of says that. I mean, here advocating traditional family and whatnot, and yet, in my life, and in my background, there was plenty of behavior and tendencies and orientations and so on, patterns that were contrary to that. I don't want to give the secrets of my book away, Confessions of a Black Conservative, for free. I want people to actually read the book and be prompted to read it by being teased here with my oblique reference to early signs of the kind of collapse of traditional living patterns that we've witnessed in a large part of Black America. I think those signs were there. So I think you're right to be alert to that. But I think there was something more wholesome. There's a book that I love by a guy called Scott Davis. The book is called The World of Patience Gromes, Gromes. She was a daughter of a landowning African-American family in the Virginia Hill Country in the late 19th century. And she grows up a princess, playing the piano, ballet lessons or whatever. She's a respectable Negro woman. and she marries and she moves to Richmond, Virginia, and she has children, and the children grow up, and the neighborhood is uh, respectable. I keep using that word, but I mean, that was really an important part of the ethos. I mean, the reason that people are dressed so well on the streets of Harlem in those old clips that you're looking at is they had a sense of pride, and they were, and a questing for dignity and respectability. But in any case, the World of Patience Groans chronicles the collapse of the Richmond, Virginia neighborhood that this woman, who comes to be an old woman, has children, has grandchildren, is living in exactly the same house. And it was a house that her husband built practically with his own hands. Her husband, who was working on the railroad as a porter. It was a very high quality job. This was a very classy family. But everything kind of collapses around them. So by the time you get to the 1950s, it's a completely different world. The world of Patience Groans is gone. That's just an anecdote. It's one case, but I think something was lost. That was what you asked me, and yes, I think something was lost.
So what? One model of what happened is, if you consider Black America and White America as two quasi-separate societies, that are living in close concert sometimes, you can model Black America at the time as a society that was closer to chaos than White America was. In other words, when you pull the string, Black American society was closer to unraveling than White American society at the time would have been. And so what you can see superficially as two pretty stable societies, one can be more vulnerable to the intervention of kind of cultural, I don't know what you want to call it, libertine kind of philosophy, something, a loosening of norms around sexuality and marriage and all of that. And so you can get in the 60s and 70s a dramatically different unraveling where Black America, the marriage rate simply goes from 80% to 30%. And you see a far more modest decline among white Americans and much less of the subsequent, crime problems with crime and addiction and so forth. I mean, does that model seem like it might be basically correct?
I think that's clever. I think it is plausible. It rings true to me, in fact. The idea is you have common shocks, common external effects, like the presence of welfare programs, where in the early days, the woman was discouraged from having a stable relationship with the man in order to be eligible to get the support for her child. And moreover, before the child comes along, the woman could rely on the fact that even if the man doesn't come through and I'm saddled with the child, I know that the cost of that to me will be underwritten to a certain degree by the public provision. That's a shock. The advent of that set of social policies through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s is common to everybody. But the effects of that by racial demographic, racial/class demographic, might be really very different. And the common shock could lead to the development of very different patterns of behavior within these subpopulations. I think that's more than plausible. I think there's a good case for it. I would emphasize not only the racial dimension of that. I would say that if cultural elites who are trendy and coastal and postmodern in their sensibility, they don't think much about marriage. They're libertines as far as sex and drugs and that kind of thing is concerned. They have whatever their most recent enthusiasms might be, that are whatever they are. And they get projected because they have the megaphone. They control what's on the TV and the movie screens, the sensibility of the elite journalists, the kind of tenor of the culture is set by them. And they do drugs when they're young. They have a lot of unprotected sex and a lot of come and go relationships, and they're free. They're liberated. That might cause them some problems early in life, but those are problems perhaps from which they and their children can recover. It might be a lot harder for somebody who's living in a dying Midwestern town where the factory has closed or the mine is no longer functional, the whatever. Those same orientations might produce consequences in the lives of those people from which they don't recover. They don't have the human and social capital resources. They don't have the financial resources. They don't have the dexterity and the wherewithal to be able to take on the consequences of those behaviors and then remedy them. Then you get a bigger hit, a bigger negative hit at the bottom end. So I just modify your suggested model by saying I think it doesn't only apply to race.
Right.
I mean, isn't it Charles Murray's argument in that book, Coming Apart? Isn't it Robert Putnam's argument in his book, Our Kids? Putnam, the political scientist at Harvard, Murray, the famous author of The Bell Curve, who's a conservative social critic. But in his book, Coming Apart, I mean, he's saying, it's not about race at all, that book. It's about class, and it's about the very different lives lived by people in American society, white people in his case, who are located in different positions in the class structure in terms of marriage, longevity, education, drug addiction, and other kinds of social pathology. And I think in a way it's also Robert Putnam's argument in Our Kids that the disparity in the ability to cope with the vicissitudes of the modern social world across different class locations in American society is a very important feature of our time.